Hi, this is Pat Sauer. Welcome to the Weeds and Invasive series of webinars. We're traveling around Iowa and we have Dr. Tom Rosberg from Drake University who's going to join us shortly and get us started on the tour this year. So welcome and stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Tom Rosberg, professor at Drake University. And here we are standing on a pasture, a privately owned pasture in central Iowa. We're going to start the webinar series on weeds and non-native plants. So when you think about weeds, there's actually three terms probably that we need to kind of think about a little bit there. There's the term weeds, there's the term non-native plants, which means, of course, a species that's not native to a particular place, not native to Iowa, not native to North America, for example. And then there's the term invasiveness. So let me just kind of see if I can kind of clarify some of those terms for you, because we're going to be focusing on non-native plants. So non-native plants, again, that's pretty easy. They're not indigenous to a particular place. Now, sometimes the term weeds is also applied to non-native plants because quite often, most of the things we think of as weeds are also non-native plants. I think most people probably would agree that a weed, the term of what we mean by a weed is simply a plant that we don't want to have growing in a particular place. So we can talk about weeds in our garden or weeds in our flower beds, weeds in our crop fields, weeds in our pasture, whatever that species is that is essentially not supposed to be there or is somehow maybe hurting the potential for crop production or forage production. We think of those as weeds. Again, most of the time we would probably find that those are also non-native species. Then the term invasive species is used when we're describing a plant. Again, not saying whether it's native or not really, but invasive species as one that is capable of establishing and colonizing in a habitat, and because of its ability to compete, its ability to disperse and establish well, maybe its ability for chemical inhibition of other plants, because of its aggressiveness, its vegetative growth. It's got some characteristics that really help it establish and increase the population size, increase the number of individuals in that population rather quickly, and therefore then sort of start to overcome and affect the other species. Quite often an invasive species, again, is a non-native species. So again, a lot of times there is a strong correlation there, because quite often the one reason a species can be so invasive is because it is non-native, because again, that helps it to escape its evolutionary determined control species. Wherever it evolved, wherever it's from, there's usually a community there of other species that it interacts with in ways that would tend to limit its growth in some way. These would be pathogens, herbivores, predators, competitors, again, that it evolved with. When it somehow gets moved from Asia or Europe to North America and leaves those other species behind, the species that help to regulate its population size, it essentially escapes those, comes into a novel environment where, again, it doesn't have any of those species. It becomes sort of a super species in a sense then, and has a great advantage, again, over native species, which, again, do have a set of species that do help to control their population size. So it is kind of a mixed bag of things that we're talking about, but I would say, again, weed, a species we simply just don't want growing in a particular place. A non-native species or exotic species, one that did not evolve in a particular place. And invasive species, those that are able to establish and overcome other species in an environment. So we're going to take a look at, again, this pasture here. Well, since we're going to be looking at non-native species and maybe having a focus on invasive species as much as possible, we're going to need to find environments where we tend to see more of this non-native component. And so that's not so much. I mean, you can certainly find them in natural areas, but we're going to find more of them probably and have more diversity and opportunity to see and talk about more species if we look for places in the landscape that are disturbed, have at least some kind of use going on, have more early successional types of environments. Because again, that's another feature again of sort of a weedy species, is one that is adapted to that's adapted to early successional types of environments. So a pasture, parking lots, disturbed areas are what we'll be looking for more in the landscape. And again, this is a cool season pasture here. We can talk about many species here because most of these species, again, being a cool season pasture, are not native. So we'll start with some that we see right here in front of me. We'll go over here and take a look at this this one that's just got some basil leaves right here. It's a real common species that we find in usually a little bit damper soils. You can see the leaves here. I'll go ahead and just pull one leaf up. It has these very long basil leaves, curly, kind of wavy margins along the edge of the leaf here. Many of you probably know this. This is curly dock, Rumex crispus, in the smartweed family. It is somewhat of an invasive species, and in some places I think you could argue that it might be tending to be that way. This is just in the vegetative state here, of course, and it's too early to see any of the flowers or fruits yet. But pretty distinctive in the form of that leaf and the curly, wavy margin along the leaf edge there. So it's a pretty easy one to learn. Right here in front of me is one that is in flower, and probably we'll be seeing many species, quite a few species that are in this family. This is the mustard family. We can recognize mustards right away, usually by just taking a quick look at the flowers and seeing that there's 4 petals. The 4 petals are not fused in any way. There's usually 6 stamens if we take a closer look and count those. But many of the mustards are early summer, late spring types of species. This one is called yellow rocket. The yellow flowers give it that name. It's Barberia vulgaris, the scientific name. And I guess as far as good characteristics, the lower leaves, mid-calling leaves on yellow rocket are fairly distinctive. They usually are pretty deeply lobed, as you can see in these examples here. Now, yellow rocket is, again, you could probably describe it as a weed. The farmer who farms this area probably does not really want this out in the pasture. It's not anything that is helping the pasture be productive. So in that sense, this would be called a weed. It's also not native, of course, but it's not really that invasive. As we look across this pasture, we just see a few of them here and there. And in most natural environments, I never have really seen this becoming much of a problem. Many of the mustards, and we have another mustard right here, just a little ways away. This one here is a species of tumble mustard, Cicimbrium. There are a few that are in flower, and they have yellow flowers as well. And based on the flower, which we don't have right here, but based on the flowers I've seen on some other plants, it looks like this is Cicimbrium loeslii, a pretty common species of tumble mustard. The mustards are often annuals or biennials, and that means, of course, that they really have to come up from seed each year or every 2 years at least. And many of the annual species of mustards are what we call a winter annual, which means that they produce their seeds early in the spring here, and then the seeds will be dormant over the summertime. They break their dormancy over the summertime and then germinate in the fall. And there's a little bit of growth in the fall, just enough to produce a little bit of a small rosette plant. That rosette plant overwinters. It overwinters by being able to protect itself from freezing temperatures with antifreeze. And then because it's already that far along, when it starts warming up in the spring, just as soon as it starts getting warm, those little rosette plants can begin growth. And of course, they're way ahead of anything else at that time. And those plants then produce, the rest of the shoot system is produced, and flowers and seeds are made. And those seeds are then dispersed again at the beginning of the summer. So many of the species that are annuals and biennials, and we'll talk more about this later, and maybe we can cover it more in the webinar, but whether if you're dealing with something that's an annual or a biennial and you're worried about controlling it, a lot of what you really need to be thinking about is stopping the plant from producing seed, because it's that seed that's going to perpetuate that population. If you can limit that or reduce that, then slowly the plant's going to fade away. Now there's some others that are also here. There's this grass that is right all around us right here, all around me. You can see that it's producing flowers here. I'll just pull one up. One thing about dealing with non-native species, you don't have to feel bad about pulling them up, I guess, and to show them. Here we're getting the beginning of the flowers up here at the top. So this is a brome, annual brome, based on, again, what I can see here of the developing florets and the spikelets here and the awns and so forth. It looks like it's Japanese brome, the amount of pubescence I'm seeing on the sheaths down here, and just sort of its overall gestalt look. It looks like Bromus japonicus, which again is an annual, non-native species of brome. It is, of any of the species that we've seen so far, I would say that this one is probably the one that has the capacity to become more invasive and again, more of a problem. It is sometimes a problem in prairies or grasslands. It is a big problem out west. There's a couple other species, Bromus tictorum, chess, and then there's probably 3 or 4 other species of annual brome that we can have. But Bromus japonicus is, I think, by far the most common one. And then we'll take a look at this clump of grass right here, because it is real common out here. But again, remember, we're in a pasture, and so these are grasses that the landowner has intended to be out here primarily for forage production. I'm pretty sure he doesn't want the Japanese brome, because that is more of a weed, but this is something that he does want. This is a forage grass. And again, based on just the vegetative characters that I can see here, I know that this is a species of fescue, but which species of fescue? I'm going to look at the base of the leaf right down here, where the ligule is, and where there's some little auricles, which are little leaf-like, or excuse me, little ear-like lobes that are on either side of the stem here. And by looking at that and seeing, just verifying, once again, I'll take another look here quick, but I don't see any hairs at all in that area. That would suggest that it's meadow fescue, which is Festuca pratensis. Again, common forage grass used in cool season pastures, both meadow fescue, this one, and another species of fescue, tall fescue, Festuca arundinaceae, they're both likely out here, and again serving as one of the main forage grasses. Right, we are working on identifying non-native species, weedy species, invasive species, and we're looking at a pasture here in central Iowa in the first part of May. So we're seeing things mainly, a lot of things are going to be in their vegetative state. We're going to be seeing a few things at least in flower, some of the mustards, but we'll probably see some of these species again later on, so this will hopefully help you see them both in early vegetative states and then later on see them in their flowering states. We've moved down the stream a little bit here and we found a few more species of non-native plants. The first one we're going to take a look at is called black medic, Medicago lupulina. I have a little bit of a sprig here of one of those stems. It's a low-growing plant. I can point to it down here. It's a legume. So as many legumes have, it has trifoliate compound leaves, so 3 leaflets. The leaflets are really small. They have a really strongly angled or wedge-shaped base and are pretty hairy. This one has a few little flowers that are beginning to form, and the flowers are really tiny. They form a little sort of spherical cluster. That's one of the ways that you'll recognize it, those small little heads of yellow flowers. Medicago lupulina, or black medic, is, again, is introduced into this pasture like some of the other legumes we're going to be seeing here in just a little bit. The clovers, probably again, of course, as an important nitrogen fixer, as a way to, again, provide some extra quality forage for the cows. Of course, this is a species that in a native environment, native prairie, for example, we wouldn't want to see it. Medicago lupulina is sometimes a problem in sites that are undergoing reconstruction, especially if they've been in a pasture or cool season grass. But I find that it's really not all that invasive. I don't think it really is too hard of a plant to get rid of. Medicago lupulina, black medic. We found some more legumes. These two are a little bit more important. Red clover first, right here. So if we have flowers, of course, red clover and white clover are pretty easy to tell apart. Without flowers, we have to just use the vegetative characteristics that we can see here in these plants. And I find that most of the time red clover and white clover are pretty distinctly different when you look at again, the compound leaves. These are trifoliate, or leaves with 3 leaflets. I'll hold up, here's a red clover, here's a white clover, some white clover leaves. Get rid of the grass there. And so you can see that there's a difference in size. Generally, white clover leaflets are a lot smaller. These right here, compared to the red clover leaflets over here. Red clover leaflets usually have a pretty well-marked chevron, this white marking we can see on the surface, upper surface of the leaflets here. And white clover generally lacks that, although you can see maybe a bit of one sometimes, just a slight one. Another characteristic that I can see with my hand lens is the red clover leaflets here are pubescent. There's hairs all along the petiole here. There's hairs on the ventral side of the leaflets here, whereas the white clover leaves are glabrous. There's no hairs at all really on any of these. So again, when they're in flower, this one's white, this one's red, much easier to distinguish then. Now, of course, out here again in the pasture, they're important nitrogen fixers to help increase, the growth of the grasses. But in a prairie planting, for example, these are really a problem. And again, probably I've seen the most difficulty usually in a situation, again, where you have a former pasture or cool season grassland that has clover in it, and then you're trying to convert that to a prairie. You really need to take extra time to get rid of the clovers before you put any seed down. Red clover, I think, is probably the more difficult of the two species. It's the one I tend to see, causing the most problems. It's a little bit bigger plant. It will grow a little bit taller overall than what white clover does. So just on its pure size, it's a little bit more of a problem species. So this is Trifolium pratensis over here, red clover, Trifolium pratensis. And this one over here, Trifolium repens, white clover. All right, I found another mustard here. Remember, we're going to see probably quite a few mustards this time of year. I know it's a mustard again because of the white flowers. Mustards are usually white or yellow, and they have 4 petals. This one is pretty easy to distinguish. It's a species called Lepidium campestre, or field cress. One of the things as you start working with mustards that's going to be important is to distinguish whether or not the leaves have a base that is sort of lobed at the base. So the base of these leaves here have little lobes at the bottom. Those little lobes kind of wrap around the stem just a little bit. That's called auriculate clasping. So whether the leaves are clasping like these are, or whether they're not, they would not be clasping if they had a little petiole there. That's an important characteristic. Then for most of the time for the mustards, it really does help to have the fruits. Now we don't have any fruits yet here, we just have the flowers. But most keys, if you're going to be using a key, would probably make reference to the types of fruits and the size and shapes of those fruits. So most of the time you will be able to see mustard fruits because, again, they're early, usually pretty early in the growing season, and those fruits will just stay on that plant for several weeks. So again, this one is Lepidium campestre, field cress, based on the clasping leaves here. The base of the leaves are clasping, the leaves are sessile, there's no stem there, and just the white flowers. Well, I have 3 more non-native species here we can take a quick look at. We're in a little more of a shady portion of this pasture here underneath some big trees. First one is this one right here. I'll just snatch a stem here, hold it up a little bit better here. So this one has square stems. So we know right away this is a mint. It has a little bit of a minty smell to it, although not that pleasant. This is Leonoris cardiaca, or motherwort. There's 3 species of Leonoris in Iowa. This one is, I think, the most common one. It's the one I come across the most. So again, the square stems, certainly an important clue here. The leaves are, as in mints, are opposite. And the Leonoris or motherwort leaves always kind of have a, I don't know, you might say sort of a look, looks a little bit like a gooseberry leaf. They have sort of an overall round or somewhat ovate shape with a lot of lobing, deep lobing going on in some places here. As they will have a very characteristically mint flower a little bit later on in the year. Motherwort is, again, non-native. I wouldn't put it into the invasive category probably from what I've seen. I see it occasionally, sort of mostly in more shaded environments, so forest environments, woodland environments, but not to a great extent. The next one right here in front of me, and there's quite a bit of it all around here, is another grass. So we're looking at another cool season forage grass. Here's a clump of it right here. Pull another stem up. This one is starting to form spikelets here at the top. This is orchard grass, Dactylus glomerata. Now, one of the characteristics that show up already here is the shoot here, the stem is somewhat flattened. In fact, as you go a little bit further up, up here at the top here where the last leaves have come off, it's really flat through here. When the flower heads, the spikelets are fully formed, it's got a pretty characteristic inflorescence. The spikelets are all really tightly clumped together in small little groups. And one more right here is another mustard. Surprise, surprise, right? So this one does have the fruits well formed, and so when you have those fruits, boy, that's a big help, because the types of fruits, the size and shapes of them are a helpful clue to what you've got. So in the mustards, the Brassicaceae, we classify the fruits as one of two types. This type right here, we look at these, the size of these fruits, the length, we look at the length compared to the width. In fact, if we take the length to width ratio, if that is 3 or less, in other words, if it's less than 3 times longer than wide, we call that a silicle. If the fruit's much more slender and elongated so that it's more than 3 times longer than wide, we call that a silique. So this is clearly a silicle. The fruits here are just a little bit longer than they are wide. And that's just the distinctive size of them, the way that they are attached to the stem here. This is all characteristic of pennycress. The leaves again are sessile. There's no petiole here. They don't really have a clasping base in this case, but there's no leaf stem there. The leaves are attached to the stem by their base. Pennycress, Flapsea arvense is the scientific name for it. It has white flowers. Here's another mustard to take a look at. Plenty of mustards this time of year. This one I would put into the weed category, a common weedy species. This is called shepherd's purse, Capsella bursipastorius. So again, it's got the characteristic 4-petaled flowers. Here we also have fruits. So the fruits again are very helpful in the mustards. And in this case, again, we have, in this case, very distinctive little fruits here. They're silicles because again of their size. They're less than 3 times longer than they are wide. And these have a very distinctive heart shape to them. So they are attached by the base of the heart, and then towards the top of the fruit, you have the 2 lobes that give it that heart shape. Capsella bursipastorius, shepherd's purse. This is, again, a very weedy species growing in yards, gardens. Here it's growing along a cattle trail. So it really likes disturbance. I found an individual of goat's beard. This is Tragopogon dubius. There's a couple of species of Tragopogon in Iowa, but this one is the most common one, and we see the most often. This one often, looks a little bit like a dandelion when it's in flower and has the same kind of dandelion flowers, forming those big puff balls, but larger than what a dandelion is. We don't quite have that yet. This is the flower bud right here, so it's just beginning to form, so it's a little ways off. But we can identify this one vegetatively pretty easily by these very characteristic leaves. It has these leaves that are very, very, very long, narrow, almost grass-like leaves. They're completely glabrous. There's no hairiness on any of them. And they're fairly crowded. A lot of leaves you can kind of see crowded onto this stem, this shoot. And they again taper to a very slender, narrow point. This one is, of course, again, non-native. It's not native to North America. I would not put it into any kind of invasive or really weedy category so much, though. Usually just see it scattered here and there. But the one that is right below me is much different. There's about 5 or 6, maybe 7 or so rosettes here of musk thistle. This is, again, a pretty common weedy species, and maybe even getting to the point of being somewhat invasive in some places. So we'll probably see these thistles as we go along during the growing season, and we'll see them later on in flower. All the thistles, have these, especially this species, and those that are biennials have these basal rosettes early on. I'm trying to pull a leaf off here, but it's so prickly I really can't get my hands down in there very well without getting stuck. The musk thistle, Carduus nutans is the scientific name. Probably the thing you would confuse this the most with would be bull thistle. Bull thistle and musk thistle, again, about the same size of rosettes, similar size and similar flowering later on. I think the thing that tells me this is musk thistle and not bull thistle is just the shininess and the glabrousness of these leaves. Bull thistle usually has a duller kind of grayish green look to the leaves. And again, this one is a lot more shiny. When the plants are in flower, you can tell them apart by the flowers. So musk thistles are something that probably need to be controlled. I think they might be one of those species that are on the noxious weed list. So what you saw there at the beginning of that shot is this species right here. We have a single individual over here. Now we're standing in a reconstructed prairie. This was formerly an agricultural field a few years ago. So there's the prairie planting underway here. So again, this is a type of environment we would call early successional. We're also near the edge of it and near a little small riparian woodlot or small forest, and that's where all of this is coming from. That area over there, again, has a very dense understory of honeysuckle. So this is Lonicera mackii, a mure honeysuckle, one of 3 species of honeysuckle in Iowa and in the Midwest. This is a really good example of an invasive species and what we mean by that. Here's a good example of what the leaves look like. Honeysuckles are not too hard to tell apart vegetatively. If you have the flowers or fruits, it helps a little bit. But this one, mackii, has very slender, sort of tapering leaf points. You can see those forming on these young leaves there. They're not quite fully formed yet. Over there in the forest, it's very dense, and again, because of that, we can, I think, certainly agree that it's an invasive species. We see it all over the Midwest, of course. I've seen many environments, many places I've done plant surveys that are just almost to the point of impenetrable in terms of walking through because of the density of the plants. And so it is a huge concern. Has a huge impact on native biodiversity, of course, when it gets to that point, and a really huge challenge and struggle in terms of what to do about it. You can work on removing it, maybe little by little, but you're going to have to get probably the seed bank removed as well. There's probably seeds in the soil seed bank, and so it's not going to be that easy to get rid of. And of course, as you're trying to remove it, we need to be trying to get native species out there to take the place. So it is a huge challenge, and we can talk more about it during the webinar. A couple other species that I want to point out here in the reconstruction. One of them is this really small plant right here. We do see some larger plants about, and usually there's also some larger plants over there on the roadside. I'm going to go ahead and pick this, but this is something you should never do probably, because this is wild parsnip, Pastanaca sativa. And as I'm sure many of you probably know, this plant produces a sort of photoactivated chemical that for many people can cause really severe rash, skin rash. I've seen some students of mine come in contact with this up at Lakeside Lab, and the result was just a disastrous, large, oozing sore on their leg. I seem to be completely insensitive to it and have been all my life. Pastanaca sativa, wild parsnip, this is a biennial. It is pretty common, and I would say approaches invasiveness in some prairies, probably both reconstructions like this, and I see it as a problem on native remnant prairies too. So as a biennial, again, one goal should always be to never let it go to seed, if at all possible. Do whatever you can to make sure that if it's in the flower stage or beginning to form fruits, that you somehow interrupt that by even just simply cutting it and picking up the material so it doesn't have a chance to even mature even a few seeds. You could get a little more aggressive probably and start digging it up, I suppose. They make some tools that can be used to dig the taproots out. But certainly one, again, that needs to be controlled. And then we have a really small little plant over here I wanted to point out to you. I'll pluck one or two here up so we can maybe see a little bit better example of it here. This is a species called tansy mustard. So again, we're looking at some more mustards. But in this case, this is a native species. Tansy mustard is recognized by its very heavily dissected or compound leaves here, almost fern-like little leaves here because they're lobed so much. It does have yellow flowers. We can see a few of those up here at the top. It's forming its fruits here as well. These are fairly short little silicles as well, less than 3 times longer than wide. But this, again, as I said, is a native species. And so I think one thing that's important about this series, I know that, non-native plants aren't necessarily the thing we all want to be, enjoying and going out to see and view. But understanding which species are non-native and which are not, and how to identify them is important. This is a native species that I would put into the category of being a weed. And by that I mean the term weed is often used to describe what an ecologist would use a little bit more appropriate term, a ruderal species. A ruderal species, an R-selected species, is a plant that has evolved a strategy and is sort of designed to colonize disturbances. What we mean is an early successional species. So when a disturbance happens, and of course when this was prepared and planted as a seeding for a prairie, it most certainly was disturbed. It was disturbed repeatedly when it was a farm field. And that disturbance, again, is done in order to favor crops like an annual species. So the native species that are annuals often do serve this role as a ruderal species, an early successional species. One of their important functions in the system is to colonize these disturbances, get vegetative cover on them, and again, just begin the successional process that will gradually see that community change. So ruderal species like this, again, since it's native, are more appropriate, at least. I mean, I would say it's not necessarily bad that this is here. It's just an example and helping to show that, again, this is a rural type of an environment. We would rather see native rural species doing what they are evolved to do in an environment like this, rather than non-native rural species such as that wild parsnip. Here is another, what I would classify as invasive, very invasive woody shrub. This is Russian olive, Elaeagnus angustifolia. It's starting to form flowers here, so we could use those to help identify it, but we really don't need them because the foliage is pretty distinctive. Now, there's two species of Elaeagnus. This one, Russian olive, is the most common. There's another one, autumn olive, that's also present. And the thing that distinguishes them, you can look at the leaves and the twigs with a hand lens, and the presence of these little rusty colored or reddish colored little scales on the young twigs, and even sometimes on the leaves, is indicative of Russian olive. This one is also got some little thorns on it, so it's kind of prickly. That makes it a little bit harder to deal with. And again, unfortunately, it was planted. It was brought here and planted for, I think, maybe wildlife purposes, but that's another example of, again, of a huge mistake. And it too is probably not quite as widespread as honeysuckle. I don't see it quite as much, but where it is, it can form, again, very dense stands, be very, very much of a problem. And I believe that it is probably a little bit harder to get rid of than the honeysuckle. So another very bad invasive species, Russian olive. We are standing again in this reconstructed prairie, 2 or 3 years old probably. It's on the floodplain of a stream here right beside us. And you saw in that shot, as it was panning this direction, down in the actual, right along the stream bank there, near the stream, there were some clumps of, larger clumps of green colored grass. We're seeing some more of that up here, and that is reed canary grass. One of the biggest problems in any kind of riparian environment, floodplain environment, any place where the soil is somewhat damp. It's not real dense right through here, but I can pull up a few stems or tillers of it here. Reed canary grass is a species that we also refer to often as being a cryptic species. And that simply means that it's hard to determine what its actual status should be in terms of native or non-native. It is known to be what's called a circumboreal species. So the species itself was native to all the continents, all around the northern latitudes. So North America did have native reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinacea, but that's probably not what we see, of course, in most of the environments that we have here. Instead, a cultivar that was developed in Europe to be used as erosion control, forage production. It was designed and genetically created to be very aggressive and reproduce vegetatively, so it would be good at holding the soil, especially along terraces or in waterways. That's the cultivar. We have to just call it a cultivar, or a version of reed canary grass that, again, really is not native in that sense, because it's been changed. That's the form of reed canary grass that I think we mostly deal with. So it is a very difficult species to control. It's probably one of the most important problem species in wetlands, and especially sedge meadows, wet mesic prairies, places that, again, floodplain environments that have a somewhat damp soil. There are a variety of techniques. Again, we can talk more about this in the webinar. I'm actually conducting a study right now on a sedge meadow in Madison County, investigating different methods of controlling this species, basically looking at the use of fire, the use of mowing, and the use of clethodim, herbicide, in various combinations to see if we can, of course, remove the reed canary grass, but without damaging the native sedge meadow species that are still there. So more on that. The other one here, this is a double whammy. Not only, again, do we have this very invasive and difficult reed canary grass, I'm also standing in equally as difficult and invasive crown vetch. All of these, this patch of leaves here, I'm holding up a few leaves here that are examples of the compound, many small leaflets on these leaves here. Coronaria, I think the species name was Varia. That's changed now. I think the whole name has changed. We'll have to get that to you in the webinar. But crown vetch is, of course, another species that has the same kind of sad story. Brought here to control erosion, used quite widely to stabilize banks. It certainly can do that, but boy, once it gets away, doesn't have any of those formerly population control species from where it came. And in prairies especially, it can essentially take over areas and form these dense patches where not much else is going to grow. This one is equally as difficult, in my experience, to deal with. Combination, I'm using combination of mowing it at the right time with brush cutters, using fire, and then also using herbicide late in the growing season, usually right, in September or so, as multiple ways of stressing it, and that's what it's going to take to knock it back. So again, we can talk more about this during the webinar.